This is the Chapter 10 podcast on ecological restoration. I encourage you to get the notes sheet out and follow along with the notes sheet I posted on Blackboard or handed out in class. If you have any questions, email me. The test for this chapter and previous chapter will be coming up, so make sure you have the correct notes. I would also encourage you to go back to the book and look at some of the diagrams in the book. Read the learning objectives and especially read the case study and the summary at the end of the chapter. Those will be very helpful, and some of the free response questions and multiple choice questions will come from those areas. So if we look at just the learning objectives of Chapter 10, Ecological Restoration, restoration is actually a new field. And in the chapter, we're going to look at some of the concepts of restoration ecology with a special emphasis on how ecosystems restore themselves through succession. And hopefully at the end of the chapter, you'll be able to describe what ecological restoration means, what are the goals, what are some of the basic approaches, methods, and limits that apply to restoration. Hopefully you'll be able to explain how an ecosystem restores itself through succession after disturbance. We talked about in class some of the disturbances that happen, and in Virginia the basic concept of succession that happens in our state. Hopefully you'll be able to identify some of the physical forces and biological processes that affect the land and why ecosystems do not remain in any kind of steady state. So if we look at the goal of ecological restoration, the goal is just to return, or anytime a scientist wants to restore something, the goal is to return the damaged ecosystem to a set of conditions considered functionable, sustainable, and natural. And of course, that all depends on maybe your values or what the ecosystem was before the particular disturbance, and how it's going to meet your particular needs. If we look at the balance in nature, and until the second half of the century, the predominant belief in Western civilizations was that any natural area, forest or prairie or intertidal zone, left undisturbed by people, achieved a single condition that would persist indefinitely. And this condition, as stated by the book in Chapter 3, is known as a balance of nature. And there are some major tenets to this belief, three of them in fact, that number one, nature undisturbed achieves a permanency of form in nature that persists indefinitely. Number two, if it is disturbed and the disturbing force removed, nature returns to exactly the same permanent state. And three, in this permanent state of nature, there is a great chain of being with a place for each creature. That all creatures are there to exist. So as we have discussed in Chapter 3, this description of a stable system or a steady state, and these ideas had their roots in the Greek and Roman philosophies about nature. I guess the question is, have they played an important role in environmentalism as well? In the 20th century, ecologists formalized that the belief in the balance of nature achieved a climate state, a steady state that would persist indefinitely, that had a maximum biological diversity, storage of chemical elements, and again, maximum biological diversity. But since the second half of the century, ecologists have learned that nature is not constant. There is not a steady state, because all ecosystems do undergo change, and species adapt to and need change, and that dealing with this change poses questions of human value. Just give you a second to write some of this information down. Again, you can pause this at any given time. So again, dealing with this change poses questions of human value, such as, how do we control and manage fire? Again, and what are we going to restore what are we restoring things to? So the book gives a good example. In '91, there was a forest fire in California that burned just 83 minutes, but did about $500 million worth of damage. A few years later, a wildfire in Oakland did about $1 billion worth of damage. So restoration ecology depends on science to discover what used to be, what is possible, and how these different goals can be achieved. The selection of those goals for restoration is again a matter of human value. So keep that in mind as we're reading through this information. An example the book gets into on page 182 or 10.1 are the boundary water canoe areas of the wilderness. There were about 400,000 hectares in northern Minnesota designated as wilderness. They were closed to logging and other direct disturbances. The area had a natural history of fire, an average burned about once a century. And when that did occur, at a natural rate, they have some beneficial effects. For example, the trees in the unburned forest appear more susceptible to insect outbreak and disease. And the research suggests that wilderness depends on change and that succession and disturbance are a continual process of this dynamic. Again, landscape depends on change. So if we look at the goals of restoration, what is natural? Frequently accepted that restoration means restoring an ecosystem to its historical range of variation and to an ability to sustain itself and its crucial functions. That is the goal. But several questions again arise. How can restoration that involves such things as wildfires occur without damage to human life and property? How do we factor that in? Cycling of chemicals, flow of energy, maintenance of biological diversity. So again, how do we factor these things in when we look at how to restore things? Science tells us that nature has been, or tells us what nature has been and what nature could be. And of course, our values determine what we want nature to be. There's no perfect condition. If we look at some of the possible restoration goals throughout time, pre-industrial time, the main ecosystem as they were in 1500. If we want to look at, if our goal is to maximize production independent of specific time, if we want to look at the historical range of variation, then we should create the future like the known past. If we're looking at, maintaining it or trying to restore the ecosystem to pre-agricultural times, we'll have to maintain the ecosystem as they were in 5000 BC. So these are just some possible restoration goals, table 10.1. So if we look at, again, what needs to be restored, ecosystems have all types, or ecosystems of all types have undergone degradation and need restoration. We need some of that cycling of materials. Some species need to have disturbances. But again, once again, the discussions about restoration involves our values. If you would, in your book, I would recommend reading about the wetlands, rivers, and streams, and prairie restoration. If we look at wetlands in general, California has lost about 90% of its wetlands. In the U.S., it's about 50%. The Kissimmee River in Florida has been channelized to provide passage of big ships, and now we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to restore some of that ecosystem that we have damaged. We look at the percentage of wetlands that are available since 1780 and 1990. It's just astounding. In Iowa, only 1.2. By 1990, about 1.2 of the wetlands still exist. So that's incredible. Now we have laws that, and thanks to the EPA and its regulations, we do have laws that prohibit building on wetlands. So if you're going to build on a wetland, looking at the environmental impact of that. So definitely we've made some strides in in that area. And that's where, government can be a very good process. Prairie restoration. Prairies actually occupied more land in the U.S. than any other kind of ecosystem. And now, because of building, there's only a few remnants remain. Building and actually agriculture. The land biggest convert was agriculture. We've turned a lot of our prairie land in the Midwest to making farms. And there, of course, there's two kinds of prairie restoration: intact prairie that's never been plowed, or previous plowed land, which is a little more complicated to restore. If we look at areas along roadways that have not been plowed, there's just some narrow strips of native prairie remain. In Iowa, about 242 hectares of prairie along roadways. These are reservoirs for native plants, and uh, these prairies are used as sources for other restoration process. We take a look at what's growing there and we transplant, or we use that as research for other restoration process. And we look at the process of ecological succession. We talked about this in class. We did the little activity about succession is just the natural progression of growth over time. And here's just some terminology. Uh, Succession, recovery of disturbed ecosystems can occur naturally through succession. Primary succession, there's two types, which we did talk about in class. We didn't necessarily identify them, but there's two types of succession. The first type is primary succession, the initial establishment and development of an ecosystem where one did not exist previously. So growth where there's never been growth before, such as the exposure of rock from a glacier or a volcanic eruption. Secondary succession is what we did in the little activity in Virginia, is regrowth, the reestablishment of an ecosystem following a disturbance. So when you're weeding your garden, that's secondary succession. Here are some examples from the book. Primary succession, secondary succession from an abandoned field to a mature forest. If we look at some patterns, just some common patterns of successions, three examples: dunes, bogs, and abandoned farm field. I would suggest reading pages 187 and 188 to read through those. I'm not going to. I'm going to kind of skim through here. Dune succession. I'm going to show a picture of bog succession. Eventually, right here, this is bog succession. Eventually, this bog is going to fill in with sediments and going to form land. That's just a natural progression of what happens and what grows in a particular bog. It's fairly natural. But again, I suggest reading pages 187 and 188 in your book to cover that information. Because I want to move on to, and there's some old field succession as well. I want to move on to just some general patterns of succession. The common elements include initializing or an initial kind of vegetation, and this is again the pattern. So at the very beginning, the first common element with any succession is that there's vegetation that is specifically adapted to that condition. Small weeds, lichens, they help kind of stabilize that physical environment. The second stage with plants is still small. They're rapidly growing with seeds that spread rapidly, some maybe some larger weeds or grasses or shrubs that begin to grow, and they kind of phase out that initial vegetation. The third step, you have some larger plants, maybe some trees that begin to dominate the site and will phase out some of those lower, less shade tolerant species. But whenever the species get phased out, they become part of the soil. And that's what makes up soil. And we have a whole section in this book about soil, but it does take some, when you remove soil, and we have soil erosion through succession, it takes a long time for soil to reform. The fourth stage is which the mature forest develops. And in Virginia, it's the temperate deciduous forest. That's kind of the generic term. Or it's the white oak, the hickory, the yellow poplar trees that begin to form. Successional stages, early, middle, and late. Similar patterns seen with animals and other life forms at each stage as well, where species characteristics are, of early stages are called pioneers. The pioneers lay the groundwork, pioneer species. They lay the groundwork for everything else for succession to actually happen. The late successional species tend to be slower growing, longer lived, and larger. If we look at picture here, the abundance, weeds, short-lived herbaceous plants, and then their populations begin to decline as the early successional trees begin to grow, and their populations begin to die out as the late successional trees happen. If we want to look at the increasing biomass, community changes over time. Then we want to look at the increasing organic matter, which increases over time. Soil, organic matter, and total ecosystem storage of the chemical elements over time gets bigger because when things die, they get recycled and become part of the soil. A very important concept. If we look at succession and chemical cycling. And again, if you did not get here, I'm going to scroll back to make sure you get this in your notes. Successional stages, 1, 2, 3, middle, late. Similar patterns seen with animals. Make sure you fill this information in. In the early stages, biomass and biological diversity increase. In the middle stages, gross production increase and net production decrease. Okay, moving on to succession and chemical cycling. So the storage of chemical elements is generally increases during the progression due to two reasons. Number one is that organic matter stores chemical elements, and as one increases, the other will increase as well, nitrogen fixation. The second is that the presence of living and dead matter helps to stop erosion. So if you keep on adding to the soil, or if you keep on adding organic matter, it's going to lessen the amount of soil erosion. There'll be more of a it'll be more of a surface that'll absorb water. So if we look at the general rule, the greater volume of soil and the greater percentage of organic matter in the soil, the more chemical elements will be retained, less erosion. And this varies with average size of course, with soil particles as well. If we want to look at the chemical storage capacity of these soils, the large particles like sand have a smaller total surface area and can store a smaller quantity of chemical elements. The smaller particles like clay can store greater quantities of these chemical elements. So soils store large quantities of chemical elements, but not as readily available as those two living organisms. Sometimes those chemical elements still have to be fixed. So if we're looking at the increase in chemical element does not continue indefinitely. With no disturbance, an ecosystem will have a slow loss of the stored chemicals. And so that's why disturbances are so important. That's why fire is actually very important to keep on recycling some of these chemical elements. If we look at what happens in nitrogen fixation, over time with no disturbances, nitrogen fixation happens less and less. If we look at phosphorus per unit area, it's going to decrease post-late succession. Right? We need some of these disturbances to happen. Moving along to how species change in an ecosystem. Earlier and later species in succession may interact in three different ways. Facilitation, interference, and life history's differences. If they don't interact, the result is chronic patchiness, which we'll get to in just a few minutes. But facilitation is when one species can prepare the way for the next species. They facilitate. So the weeds prepare the ground for shrubs to grow. The shrubs prepare the ground for trees to grow. Those trees prepare room for the larger trees. Interference in early successional species can, for a time, prevent the entrance of later successional species. Life history differences and chronic patchiness. Let's move along to facilitation. So knowing the role of facilitation helps with restoration. These plants, again, can be planted first and help facilitate some of the later stages of succession, those organisms. Again, facilitation. Pine, oak. Pine provides shade to help oak trees grow and develop. Interference, again, certain early species interfere with the entrance of others. So grasses may form dense mats blocking other seeds from actually germinating. They break that mat. The breaks in the mat allow others to be established. So we have grass that might interfere with the pine trees to sprout and sprout and grow and develop. We look at life and its history differences. An example is seed dispersal. And early successional species are readily transported by wind or animals. In late successional species, seeds take longer to travel, and seedlings can tolerate the shade. So it depends on the life history of the seed dispersal. Chronic patchiness. I mentioned this a couple of times. It's common in desert where major shrub species grow in patches. The patch persists for a long period of time until the next disturbance. And this, as life tends to build up, they tend to aggregate. And the non-biological processes tend to erode or degrade. Give you a second to write some of this down. I'm kind of speeding along here. So again, this the idea of this chronic patchiness is that species just don't interact, and that succession, as we've described it, just doesn't take place. That's what chronic patchiness kind of does. And an example the book uses is that in California, Arizona, Mexico, some of those deserts, major shrub species grow in patches, which often consist of mature individuals with few seedlings. These patches tend to persist for long periods until there is a disturbance. And similarly, in highly polluted environments, a sequence of species replacement may not occur. So what kind of changes occur during succession depends on the complexity between life and its environment. Life tends to build up or aggregate where non-biological processes in the environment tend to erode and degrade. And in some of these more harsh environments where the energy and chemical elements required for life are limited and disturbances are frequent, the physical degrading environment dominates and succession does not occur. So if we want to apply our knowledge to restore some of these heavily damaged lands or ecosystem, some examples or some efforts being made in Great Britain are undoing mine damage. So the idea is to remove the toxic pollutants, restore the biological production, and restore attractiveness of the landscape. So in Great Britain, there are some mines that have been used since the medieval times, about 55,000 hectares to be exact. They've been heavily damaged and mined, and so these recent programs have been initiated to remove the toxic pollutants from the mines and the mine tailings and restore these damaged lands to useful biological production and restore the visual attractiveness of this landscape as well. The agricultural approach has failed because grasses have died and the land, of course, was barren again. You had to start all over again. So the ecological approach has been successful, planting pioneer species, early successional species that paved the way for middle successional species, which paved the way for later successional species. Here's an example. So what I would suggest to you is go back and read the summary in your textbook on page 195. Read the textbook, read the summary. Changes in the kinds of species found in succession can be due to facilitation, interference, or simply life history differences. That is a key point of this particular chapter. Go back and read those bullet points. We usually get some great questions from those. I would also recommend going back and looking at table 10.1. Some possible restoration goals. I would highly recommend looking at table 10.2, the patterns of interactions. Go back and read the case study at the beginning of the chapter, the hands that rock the cradle of civilization, the talk about the Tigris and Euphrates marshlands and the restoration process that are involved.